China's tanker was hit in Hormuz, and Beijing just realized America's trap. Why the attack on a Chinese tanker in Hormuz may mark the end of Beijing's strategic neutrality. There are moments in geopolitics when a single burning ship reveals the architecture of an entire era. The attack on a Chinese-owned tanker near the Strait of Hormuz may prove to be one of those moments. On the surface, the incident looked merely like another episode in the increasingly chaotic shadow conflict unfolding across the Persian Gulf. A vessel carrying refined petroleum products, owned by a Chinese shipping company, caught fire after being attacked near the Emirati coast. No group claimed responsibility. Iran denied involvement. Washington immediately suggested Tehran was responsible. Markets trembled, insurers recalculated risk premiums, and global shipping operators quietly updated their contingency models, yet the deeper significance of the attack lies elsewhere. For the first time since the Hormuz crisis began, the instability consuming the Gulf has directly struck China's economic bloodstream. That changes the strategic equation, not only for Beijing, but for the entire structure of global power, because the incident exposes an uncomfortable reality that China has spent 2 decades trying to avoid. A nation cannot become the world's largest trading power indefinitely while outsourcing the security of global trade routes to someone else. And eventually, every commercial empire must decide whether it is prepared to become a military one. The strait that holds the global economy hostage, the Strait of Hormuz, is one of those geographical absurdities upon which modern civilization depends. Barely 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, the waterway carries 1/5 of globally traded oil. It is less a shipping route than the central artery of industrial capitalism. Tankers leaving Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, and Iran pass through its narrow corridor before supplying the energy systems of Asia and beyond. For decades, globalization operated under the assumption that this artery would remain open. That assumption was never entirely natural. It was enforced. The invisible guarantor of Hormuz was the United States Navy. Since the late 20th century, Washington has effectively subsidized the security of global maritime commerce through overwhelming naval dominance. America's carrier groups, surveillance systems, and regional military infrastructure created what economists might call a security commons, a protected trading environment from which allies and rivals alike benefited. China was among the greatest beneficiaries of this system. Beijing's economic rise depended not only on cheap labor and industrial policy, but also on the existence of stable maritime trade routes protected by American military power. This produced one of the defining paradoxes of globalization. China rose inside a security architecture built by the United States. For years, Beijing attempted to preserve the advantages of this arrangement while avoiding its burdens. China expanded commercially into the Middle East without deeply entangling itself militarily. It purchased Iranian oil while maintaining relations with Saudi Arabia. It cultivated Gulf monarchies while avoiding ideological confrontation. It portrayed itself as a neutral economic actor rather than a geopolitical policeman. This strategy worked remarkably well, until Hormuz became unstable. Now the contradiction is becoming impossible to ignore. The end of the illusion of commercial immunity, the psychological impact of the attack may matter more than the operational damage itself. According to Chinese reports, the vessel displayed markings identifying both the owner and crew as Chinese. Symbolically, that matters enormously. For years, Beijing operated under a quiet but powerful assumption: China's neutrality insulated it from becoming a target. The logic appeared reasonable. Unlike America, China did not sanction Iran aggressively. Unlike Israel, it was not part of the regional military confrontation. Unlike European powers, Beijing did not routinely lecture Middle Eastern states about governance or human rights. China's implicit bargain with the region was simple: we do business. We do not interfere. But the modern Middle East increasingly does not distinguish between commercial actors and strategic actors. That distinction belongs to the age of liberal globalization, a period during which economics and geopolitics appeared temporarily separable. That era is ending. In the emerging world disorder, trade itself is becoming weaponized. Commercial ships are no longer merely civilian infrastructure. They are pressure points. Insurance rates become instruments of coercion. Shipping lanes become strategic bargaining chips. Supply chains become targets. The attack on the Chinese tanker therefore represents something larger than a security incident. It signals the collapse of the assumption that economic interdependence automatically generates political immunity. In periods of systemic instability, dependence creates vulnerability instead. Iran's asymmetric logic, whether Iran directly ordered the attack, may matter less than the strategic environment Tehran has helped create. The Islamic Republic has long understood a fundamental asymmetry of power in the Gulf. It cannot defeat the United States conventionally, but it does not need to. Iran's strategic doctrine has evolved around a different principle, raising the cost of confrontation to intolerable levels. Instead of seeking decisive battlefield victory, Tehran specializes in calibrated instability. Proxy militias, maritime harassment, deniable sabotage, drone warfare, cyber operations, and psychological pressure. This is not a traditional deterrence. It is systemic disruption. The objective is not to destroy global trade outright, but to make global trade feel perpetually unsafe. That distinction is critical. Closing Hormuz entirely would provoke overwhelming international retaliation. But making Hormuz unpredictable achieves many of the same economic effects at far lower strategic cost. The brilliance and danger of gray zone warfare lies precisely in this ambiguity. Nobody fully knows who conducted the attack, whether escalation was authorized, where the red lines truly are, or which incident might trigger broader war. Such uncertainty creates a self-amplifying cycle of fear, and fear itself becomes the weapon. China's strategic nightmare. For Beijing, the crisis exposes an uncomfortable structural weakness. China today is simultaneously the world's largest industrial power, the largest energy importer, and one of the most trade-dependent major economies in history. That combination generates extraordinary vulnerability to maritime disruption. Unlike the United States, China remains heavily dependent on imported hydrocarbons flowing through contested sea lanes. Much of its economic miracle still rests upon uninterrupted maritime logistics stretching from the Gulf to East Asia. This creates what strategists often call the Malacca dilemma, referring to China's dependence on vulnerable choke points. Hormuz now joins that list more dangerously than ever. The implications are profound. If Gulf instability becomes chronic, energy prices rise, insurance costs surge, shipping schedules destabilize, inflationary pressures intensify, industrial margins narrow, and Chinese growth slows. In effect, China's economic machine becomes partially hostage to geopolitical events beyond its direct control. This is the hidden tax of global power. The larger a nation's commercial footprint becomes, the harder it becomes to remain geopolitically detached. The superpower dilemma Beijing hoped to avoid. The Hormuz crisis now forces China toward a strategic question it has postponed for decades. Can a superpower remain militarily restrained while possessing global commercial interests? Historically, the answer has usually been no. The British Empire protected sea lanes with the Royal Navy. The United States secured maritime order through carrier fleets and military alliances. Commercial dominance and naval power traditionally evolved together. China attempted something historically unusual. Global economic expansion without parallel geopolitical responsibility. The Belt and Road Initiative reflected this ambition. Beijing envisioned infrastructure connectivity, logistics integration, and trade expansion across Eurasia and beyond, without replicating the military burdens of American hegemony. But crises like Hormuz expose the limitations of that model. If Chinese ships require protection, Beijing faces unpleasant choices. Option 1 is passivity. Accept vulnerability while relying indirectly on American security guarantees, but this undermines China's image as an emerging peer superpower. Option 2 is militarization. Expand naval deployments, escort operations, overseas basing, and security commitments, but those risks drawing China into precisely the kind of expensive geopolitical entanglements it long criticized America for embracing. This is the classic imperial trap. Commercial empires eventually discover that trade routes require enforcement, and enforcement requires power projection. America's strategic opportunity. For Washington, the crisis presents an opportunity disguised as instability. For years, American policymakers complained privately that Asian economies benefited disproportionately from U.S. maritime security while contributing little to the burden. the Gulf Order effectively became an American subsidy to globalization. Now the deterioration of that order may allow Washington to restructure regional security dynamics. If attacks increasingly threaten Asian shipping, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, India, and eventually perhaps even China, may face growing pressure to participate in multinational maritime security frameworks. This would partially internationalize the costs of maintaining Gulf stability. From Washington's perspective, which is strategically advantageous, moreover, if China becomes more deeply involved in Middle Eastern security dilemmas, Beijing may discover that global leadership is vastly more exhausting than global trade. In some respects, America may welcome that realization. After all, the United States spent decades learning that maintaining open sea lanes is not simply a military mission. It is a permanent financial, political, and psychological burden. China is only beginning to encounter that reality. The age of geopolitical insurance, the most important consequence of the Hormuz crisis is conceptual rather than military. The world is entering what might be called the age of geopolitical insurance. During the high era of globalization, efficiency dominated economic thinking. Supply chains were optimized for cost minimization. Energy networks prioritize affordability. Redundancy was considered wasteful, but strategic stability can no longer be assumed. Today, corporations and states increasingly pay premiums not merely against commercial risk, but against geopolitical uncertainty itself. This changes everything. Nations now seek diversified supply chains, alternative energy corridors, strategic reserves, domestic manufacturing capacity, and reduced dependency on unstable transit routes. Security is returning to economics. The attack on the Chinese tanker illustrates this transition vividly. A single incident in Hormuz can now ripple through inflation expectations, manufacturing forecasts, insurance markets, commodity prices, and geopolitical alignments, in a deeply interconnected world. Vulnerability itself becomes contagious. The return of maritime geopolitics. For much of the post-Cold War era, maritime security faded into the background of strategic thought. The oceans appeared politically neutral, merely conduits for globalization. That illusion is disappearing. The Red Sea, the South China Sea, the Black Sea, and now Hormuz increasingly resemble interconnected theaters of economic coercion. The 21st century may revive an older geopolitical truth: whoever controls, or destabilizes, critical maritime chokepoints exert disproportionate influence over the global system. Iran understands this, America understands this, China is beginning to understand it as well. A burning tanker and a changing world. The attack on the Chinese vessel near Hormuz may be remembered less for the damage inflicted than for the illusion it destroyed. For years, Beijing believed it could remain economically global while strategically selective, deeply integrated into world commerce yet partially insulated from geopolitical confrontation. That position is becoming untenable. The modern world no longer permits easy separation between trade and power, as globalization fragments into competing spheres of security. Economics increasingly follows geopolitics rather than transcending it, and so, the burning tanker in Hormuz becomes more than a maritime incident. It becomes a symbol of transition, from the age of frictionless globalization to the age of strategic vulnerability. In that world, the defining question for great powers is no longer merely who possesses the largest economy or the strongest military, it is who can survive the insecurity of interdependence.